Prepare to delve into a tale that defies reason and reveals the darkest side of human nature. Today we'll explore together a story that remained buried in the mountains of North Carolina for over a century, a case that still sends chills down the spines of those who dare delve into the dusty Madison County archives. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from. I'd love to hear who's brave enough to follow this journey to the end. It was the year 1912. The United States was experiencing a time of profound transformation, but in the Appalachian Mountains, time seemed to move at its own pace. North Carolina was home to isolated communities, where roads were poor and communication with the outside world was sporadic. In these lands of deep valleys and dense forests, secrets could be kept for generations without anyone but the locals knowing the truth. The Appalachian Mountains have always carried an aura of mystery. Their mist-shrouded slopes, their icy streams cutting through rocky cliffs, and their winding trails disappearing among ancient trees created the perfect setting for dark stories to blossom. It was a place where nature reigned supreme, and civilization seemed but a distant suggestion. The towns were small, families had known each other for generations, and the law often took days to arrive when something went wrong. It was in this context that the name Henry Wycliffe emerged, a man whose existence would become synonymous with horror in the whispered conversations among the residents of Madison County. But who was Henry Wycliffe really? Where did he come from? And what exactly happened that winter of 1912 that ensured his name would never be forgotten? The first records of Wycliffe appear in Madison County documents around 1908. He likely arrived in the region from somewhere north, possibly Virginia or Pennsylvania, though records are imprecise on this point. What we do know is that he settled on a remote property several miles from the nearest settlement, a log cabin nestled in a clearing, surrounded by tall pines and an almost oppressive silence. Henry Wycliffe was described by the few who knew him as an ordinary-looking man, perhaps in his early 40s with a thick beard and eyes that rarely met anyone's during conversation. He didn't attend the local church, didn't participate in community meetings, and had minimal contact with his neighbors. When he went down to the village to buy supplies, he said little, paid in silver coins, and disappeared back into the trees before anyone could ask too many questions. This behavior in itself was not entirely uncommon in the region. Many men sought the seclusion of the mountains for various reasons. Some were fleeing debt, others family problems, some simply preferred solitude. But there was something about Wycliffe that bothered people. Perhaps it was the coldness in his gaze, or the way he seemed to always be observing, calculating, measuring every movement around him. The winter of 1911 to 1912 was particularly harsh. Snow blanketed the mountains with impressive thickness, and temperatures plummeted to levels that made travel extremely dangerous. Roads, already poor under normal conditions, became impassable. Families hunkered down in their homes, relying on the food stocks they had prepared to weather the harshest months of the year. It was during this period of forced isolation that something began to arouse suspicion. A farmer named Thomas Garrett, who lived about 3 miles from Wycliffe's property, noticed smoke constantly coming from the chimney of the lonely man's cabin. This in itself wouldn't be strange, were it not for the fact that the smoke carried a peculiar odor, different from the usual smell of burning wood. It was a disturbing odor, difficult to describe, but one that lingered in the nostrils and in the memory. Garrett mentioned this to some neighbors during a rare visit to the village after the weather cleared for a few days. Other residents had also noticed strange things. A hunter named William Brewster swore he saw strange lights moving around Wycliffe's property at night, lanterns that seemed to follow a specific pattern, as if someone were performing some kind of ritual or work that required precision. But what really set off alarm bells was the disappearance of a traveler. In January 1912, an itinerant merchant named Samuel Richardson was traveling through the region selling tools and fabrics. He was last seen at the village tavern, where he mentioned following the trail that passed near Wycliffe's property before descending into the next valley. Richardson never reached his destination. His wife, who lived in Tennessee, sent letters inquiring about his whereabouts, but no one heard from him. Initially, everyone assumed Richardson had gotten lost in the blizzard or had an accident on the icy trails. It wouldn't be the first time someone had disappeared in the mountains during winter. The Appalachian forests were merciless to those who underestimated their danger, but some locals began to make connections. The trail Richardson intended to follow passed very close to Wycliffe's cabin. What if something had happened there? Months passed. And as spring finally began to melt the snow, more disturbing details emerged. A shepherd grazing his sheep on the higher slopes found torn pieces of clothing hanging from bushes less than half a mile from Wycliffe's property. The clothing matched the description of what Samuel Richardson was wearing when he was last seen. The discovery of the clothing was brought to the attention of the county sheriff, a man named James Patterson. Patterson was experienced, having served as sheriff for nearly 15 years and having handled difficult cases before. But even he later admitted in recorded testimony that there was something deeply unsettling about the case from the beginning. Sheriff James Patterson decided it was time to pay an official visit to Henry Wycliffe's property. He gathered 2 deputies, trusted men who knew the mountains well, and they set out on a cold March morning in 1912. The ride to the cabin took nearly 3 hours, following muddy trails where melted snow mixed with the red earth characteristic of that region of the Appalachians. When they finally came into view of the property, what they saw was a seemingly ordinary scene. The log cabin was well preserved, its stone chimney emitting a thin line of grey smoke. Surrounding the main building were a small barn, a crumbling fence, and neatly stacked piles of firewood. Nothing immediately striking, nothing that hinted at the horrors yet to be revealed. Patterson knocked on the heavy wooden door. There was no answer. He knocked again, this time loudly announcing his presence, identifying himself as a Madison County law enforcement representative. The silence that followed was unsettling, broken only by the wind whistling through the pines and the distant sound of a stream running downhill. One of the deputies walked around the cabin, checking the windows. They were covered with dark cloths, making it impossible to see inside. The back door was locked from the inside. It seemed someone had left the property in a hurry, but they had ensured no one could easily enter. With legal authorization to investigate a possible crime, Patterson forced his way in through the front door. The lock gave way after a few firm blows, and the door swung open with a slow, ominous creak. The odor that emanated from the interior was described by the 3 men as something they would never forget. It wasn't just the smell of mildew or a house closed for too long. It was something much deeper, more visceral, making their stomachs churn and their eyes sting. The cabin's interior was dim. The covered windows allowed only the barest slivers of light, creating shadows that seemed to move across the wooden walls. Patterson lit an oil lantern and began exploring the space. The main room was simple, with a rustic table, 2 chairs, a still warm wood stove and shelves with a few supplies. Everything seemed normal, except for one detail that immediately caught his eye. There were dark stains on the wooden floor. The stains formed irregular patterns, as if something had been dragged repeatedly across the room. Patterson bent down to examine them more closely and noticed that the floorboards were oddly worn, with deep scratches in some areas. Something heavy had been moved there many times. One of the deputies found a notebook on the table. It was a diary with yellowed pages and cramped handwriting. The first entries dated back to 1908, shortly after Wycliffe had settled in the region. The initial entries were mundane: weather records, notes about needed repairs to the property, supply lists. But as the pages progressed, the tone changed drastically. The most recent entries contained disturbing reflections on loneliness, human nature, and the limits imposed by society, which Wycliffe wrote were merely artificial constructs. There were passages about travelers passing through the region, detailed descriptions of their clothing, their belongings, their habits. It was as if Wycliffe were studying these people, cataloguing them. An entry from December 1911 specifically mentioned a merchant who had stopped to ask for directions to the best route through the mountains. The description perfectly matched Samuel Richardson. Wycliffe had written about how the man seemed overconfident, unprepared for the very real dangers the mountains held. The last sentence of that entry was simply, "Some never learn that not every path leads to safety." Patterson felt a chill run down his spine. He ordered the deputies to thoroughly search the cabin while he continued to examine the diary. Then a shout came from behind the building. One of the deputies had found something in the small barn attached. The sheriff rushed over, flashlight in hand. What he saw inside the barn would prompt him to immediately call for backup and would transform the investigation into something much bigger than a simple missing person case. The barn had been converted into something that defied any rational explanation for that time and place. Tools hung on the walls, but they weren't ordinary farm implements. They seemed to have been modified, adapted, for purposes neither man could fully comprehend at the time. There were also glass jars containing liquids of various colors, some with handwritten labels containing terms that made no sense to the layman, but the most disturbing part was at the back of the barn. There was a boarded-up area on the floor, forming what looked like a trapdoor. Patterson ordered the passage opened. The wood was heavy and damp, and when they finally managed to lift it, the odor that escaped was so intense that one of the deputies had to run outside to vomit. Beneath the trapdoor was an excavation, a hole dug into the earth approximately 6 feet deep and lined with stone on the sides. It was narrow, claustrophobic, and the walls bore tool marks. Within that confined space lay evidence that would confirm everyone's worst fears. Personal belongings were scattered about: pocket watches, leather wallets, a pair of broken glasses, coat buttons, a belt buckle engraved with initials. Each item told the story of someone who had passed through and never been seen again. Patterson counted at least 12 different sets of belongings, each clearly belonging to a different person. Among the objects was Samuel Richardson's wallet. Inside were some banknotes and a small portrait of his wife. Seeing it brought a brutal reality to the investigation. Richardson hadn't gotten lost in the blizzard. He'd found something far worse in that isolated cabin. The search continued for the rest of that day and the following days. Patterson summoned more men from the village, and together they searched every inch of the property. They found more evidence buried in various spots on the property. Clothing burned in a fire pit behind the barn. Partially destroyed documents suggesting Wycliffe had assumed false identities over the years. A particularly disturbing aspect was the meticulous organization of everything. Wycliffe was not a man acting on impulse or uncontrolled madness. There was method, planning, and a calculated coolness in every action. He had chosen this particular spot precisely for its strategic position, where little-used trails converged and where lone travelers occasionally passed. The discoveries on Henry Wycliffe's property spread through Madison County like wildfire. Within days, newspapers across North Carolina began publishing stories about the case. The nearest town, which rarely saw activity beyond its 200 residents, was overrun with reporters, curious onlookers, and family members of people who had gone missing in the area in recent years. Sheriff Patterson established a perimeter around the property and pursued the investigation methodically and carefully. He knew that every piece of evidence would be crucial, not only to understanding what had happened, but also to eventually bringing Wycliffe to justice, if he could still be found. The big question plaguing everyone was, where was Henry Wycliffe at that moment? Analysis of the objects found revealed a chilling chronology. The oldest item they could date with certainty was a pocket watch with an inscription that read, "To Thomas, with love, Christmas 197. Further investigation revealed that a man named Thomas Eldridge, an itinerant blacksmith, had disappeared in the area in February 1988, just 3 months after Wycliffe acquired the property. This suggested that the horrific events in that cabin were not recent. Wycliffe had operated there for at least 4 years without arousing serious suspicion. How was this possible? The answer lay in the very isolation of the region and the profile of the victims he chose. They were always lone travelers, people without strong connections in the area, individuals whose absence would take weeks or months to be noticed and investigated. Patterson found entries in Wycliffe's diary that demonstrated a disturbing understanding of human psychology. He wrote about how to identify vulnerable travelers, how to offer help in a way that seemed genuine, how to create situations where a person felt safe before it was too late. There were passages about observing body language, about identifying those who were lost or desperate. One particularly chilling entry, dated September 1911, described an encounter with a traveling preacher who had stopped for a rest. Wycliffe wrote about how the man spoke of redemption and forgiveness while drinking tea at the table, in the very room where Patterson was now conducting his investigation. The entry concluded with a chilling observation. He believed everyone deserved a second chance. He discovered that not everyone gets one. While the search for evidence continued on the property, another line of investigation opened up. Patterson sent telegrams to sheriffs in neighboring counties, inquiring about unsolved disappearances over the past 5 years. The responses that arrived painted an even bleaker picture. At least 20 people had disappeared within a 50-mile radius of the area during the time Wycliffe lived there. Not all of these disappearances could be attributed to him with certainty. The Appalachian mountains were inherently treacherous, and people regularly got lost or had accidents. But the concentration of unsolved cases in that particular area was statistically abnormal. Something was going on there that went beyond the region's natural hazards. One detail that emerged during the investigation shed light on how Wycliffe operated. Several residents mentioned that he occasionally offered assistance to travelers who seemed lost or disoriented. He knew the trails better than anyone, and often offered to guide people or at least give detailed directions. This appearance of helpfulness was the perfect lure. One of the few who had interacted with Wycliffe and lived to tell the tale was a cattle dealer named Robert Hayes. He had stopped at the property in November 1911, just 2 months before the investigation began. Hayes remembered feeling something strange about that encounter, a visceral sense of danger he couldn't rationally explain. Hayes described how Wycliffe had insisted he spend the night at the cabin, arguing that a storm was approaching and it would be dangerous to continue traveling. But something in the man's gaze, the way he subtly blocked the door with his body, made Hayes decline. He made up an excuse about having to meet a business associate and left quickly even as the sky darkened. Now, months later, Hayes trembled as he realized how close he had come to becoming another victim. He provided investigators with valuable details about the cabin's interior at the time, confirming that some of the objects found had already been there in November. This helped establish a more accurate timeline of events. As the investigation of the property continued, a separate team was formed to track down Wycliffe. The last time anyone had seen him for sure was in early March, about a week before Patterson made his official visit to the cabin. A shopkeeper at the settlement remembered Wycliffe purchasing unusual supplies: rope, an extra lantern, enough canned goods to last several weeks, and a detailed map of western North Carolina. This suggested that Wycliffe was planning to leave the area. The question was, had he fled because he sensed the investigation was approaching, or had he simply decided it was time to move on? The pattern of behavior in the diary suggested he was cautious, always alert for signs that he might be observed or suspected. Patterson organized search parties that scoured the main trails leading west. They found evidence that someone had camped at specific points along the way, always choosing spots out of sight of other travelers. Carefully extinguished campfires, marks of someone sleeping under trees, buried food remains. It was Wycliffe, no doubt, but he had several days' head start. The hunt was made more complicated by the region's geography. The Appalachians offered countless alternative routes, hidden valleys and natural caves, where an experienced hiker could hide for weeks. Wycliffe knew these mountains better than most, and he was using that knowledge to stay ahead of his pursuers. Meanwhile, more details about Wycliffe's past began to emerge. A Virginia newspaper published a story about an unsolved case from 1966 involving similar disappearances near Roanoke. The descriptions of the circumstances were eerily similar to what was happening in North Carolina. A solitary man living in isolation, travelers disappearing, suspicions never confirmed. The connection to the events in Roanoke, Virginia, opened a new dimension to the investigation. Sheriff Patterson sent urgent letters to Virginia authorities, requesting all available records on that 1960 case. What was returned confirmed his worst fears. There were too many similarities to be mere coincidence. In Roanoke, between 1905 and 1907, 7 people disappeared without a trace. All were lone travelers, merchants or temporary workers passing through the area. Authorities at the time had investigated a man living nearby, someone described as secretive and offering help to strangers, but they were never able to gather enough evidence to file charges. Most disturbing was the suspect's physical description. It perfectly matched Henry Wycliffe. Even allowing for a few years of aging, his features were the same: a thick beard, medium height, broad shoulders, and eyes that avoided direct contact. Virginia authorities had never been able to confirm the true identity of the man, who disappeared from the region in 1907, shortly before Wycliffe surfaced in North Carolina. Patterson began to form a disturbing theory. What if Henry Wycliffe wasn't even the man's real name? What if he had used multiple identities over the years, moving from region to region, always staying long enough to commit his terrible acts before disappearing when suspicions began to grow? This would mean that the crimes uncovered in North Carolina were just the tip of a much larger, darker iceberg. The investigation expanded further when an old file was discovered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In 1903, a man with a similar description had been briefly questioned about the disappearance of workers traveling through the mining region. Again, there was insufficient evidence, and the man had left the area before a more thorough investigation could be conducted. If all these connections were correct, Wycliffe could have operated for nearly a decade in different states, leaving a trail of disappearances that were never connected because they crossed different jurisdictions and because communication between authorities in different states was poor at the time, he had perfectly exploited the limitations of the justice system of the era. Meanwhile, search parties continued to scour the mountains. In mid-April 1912, a trail turned up in a village about 80 miles to the west, near the Tennessee border. A local blacksmith reported that a lone man had passed through, paying to have his horse shod and purchasing provisions. The description matched Wycliffe. The blacksmith remembered the man asking about lesser-known routes that crossed into Tennessee, showing particular interest in trails that avoided larger settlements. He had paid in silver coins, just as Wycliffe had done, and set out the next morning, heading for the higher mountains. Patterson gathered his best trackers and followed the lead. The trail led through increasingly rugged terrain, where pine trees gave way to steep rock formations and deep gorges. It was a region few knew well, perfect for someone who wanted to disappear completely from civilization. For 3 weeks, the trackers followed intermittent signs. A dead campfire here, footprints preserved in the mud there, broken branches indicating recent passage. Wycliffe was moving quickly, but not carelessly. He covered his tracks when possible, took routes that made tracking difficult, and chose campsites where surprises were unlikely. The pursuit took the group through some of the most inhospitable terrain in the Appalachians. They crossed icy rivers, where the current nearly swept their horses away, climbed slopes where one misstep would mean a fatal fall, and spent nights in damp caves where the cold penetrated to the bone. It was a journey that tested the limits of human endurance. In May, when the trees were already showing the rich green of spring and wildflowers covered the valleys, the trackers reached a particularly remote area near the North Carolina-Tennessee border. There they found evidence that someone had set up temporary camp in a natural cave, hidden behind a waterfall cascading down a granite cliff. Inside the cave, there were clear signs of recent occupation: still warm fire ashes, food scraps, a blanket left behind. But most revealing was a small notebook, similar to the diary found in the original hut, except this one contained only a few written pages. The entries were dated March and April of 1912. The notes revealed the mental state of a man on the run. Wycliffe wrote of being pursued, of how he had underestimated the speed with which he would be discovered, of plans to cross into Tennessee and then head west, perhaps to Missouri or beyond. There were also bitter reflections on how years of careful planning had been ruined by a single error of judgment. But what had been the error? The notebook didn't specify clearly, but there were references to leaving too much evidence and trusting to the illusion of security. Patterson interpreted this as Wycliffe acknowledging that he had remained too long in one location, accumulating evidence that would eventually be discovered. The last entry in the notebook was particularly enigmatic. Dated April 28th, it simply said, "Mountains keep secrets better than men keep consciences." Perhaps it is time for me to become part of those secrets. What exactly Wycliffe meant by this would remain one of the many unanswered questions of the case. The trackers intensified their search of the area surrounding the cave. They explored every valley, every rock formation, every trail branching off from that central point, but it was as if Wycliffe had simply melted into the landscape. There were no more footprints, no more signs of camp, nothing to indicate where he had gone from there. One theory was that he had crossed into Tennessee through one of the many unmapped passes that crisscrossed that border region. Another possibility was that he was hiding in one of the countless caves that pierced the limestone mountains, waiting for the search to subside before continuing his escape. There was also the darker possibility that something had happened to him in those treacherous mountains. As the weeks passed, the search for Henry Wycliffe began to wane. Madison County's resources were limited, and keeping teams of trackers in the mountains indefinitely was simply not feasible. Patterson had to make the difficult decision to scale back the operation, keeping only a few men dedicated to following up on occasional leads. Meanwhile, attention turned to the victims. Identifying the belongings found on the property became a harrowing but necessary task. Family members of missing people traveled from across North Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee to examine the recovered objects. Each positive identification brought painful closure to someone who had spent months or years without knowing the fate of a loved one. Among the identified objects was a wedding ring with initials engraved on the inside. It belonged to Marcus Bellamy, a 32-year-old carpenter who had disappeared in June 1909 while traveling from Asheville to Johnson City. His wife Elizabeth, tearfully identified the ring, finally getting an answer about what had happened to the man who had left, promising to return in 2 weeks. Another item was a pocket watch belonging to Jonathan Price, a 45-year-old itinerant teacher who taught in rural schools too small to support a permanent teacher. Price had disappeared in October of 1910. His younger brother recognized the watch immediately. It was a family heirloom that Jonathan would never willingly leave behind. There was also an ornate belt buckle belonging to William Hodges, a Spanish-American war veteran who worked as a courier delivering mail and small packages between isolated villages. Hodges disappeared in March 1911. His family had searched for him for months, even hiring a private investigator, but had never found a trace. Each story revealed was a reminder of the vulnerability of travelers at that time. The roads were dangerous, not only because of natural hazards, but also because the vastness of the mountains offered anonymity to those with dark intentions. The distance between settlements, the lack of rapid communication, and the necessary trust between strangers created conditions where human predators could operate almost freely. The Wycliffe case also exposed the limitations of the justice system at the time. There was no efficient way to share information between different jurisdictions. A crime committed in Virginia was rarely connected to similar events in North Carolina or Tennessee, even when there were clear patterns. Each county operated essentially independently, and clever criminals could exploit these loopholes simply by crossing state lines. Patterson began corresponding with sheriffs and investigators in other states, attempting to establish an informal network. He believed that cases like Wycliffe's were not unique, and that other criminals were operating similarly in different regions. His theory was that many disappearances attributed to accidents or people simply abandoning their lives were actually something much more sinister. In June 1912, a lengthy report on the case was published in the Charlotte Observer. The article detailed the findings, the connections to previous cases in other states, and the ongoing search for Wycliffe. The publication had an unexpected effect. Dozens of letters arrived from different parts of the country, reporting similar cases of unexplained disappearances. One particularly intriguing letter came from a sheriff in Missouri. He described a series of disappearances that had occurred between 1898 and 1900 in the Ozarks. The circumstances were eerily similar. A lone man living in isolation, travelers disappearing on nearby trails, suspicions that never materialized into sufficient evidence. The man had abruptly left the region in 1901. If this connection were real, it would mean that Wycliffe, or whoever his true identity was, had been operating for over a decade before the events in Pennsylvania. This painted the picture of someone who had honed his methods over many years, learning from previous mistakes, and becoming increasingly cautious and difficult to capture. Patterson sent telegrams requesting more information about the Missouri case. The response he received included a physical description of the suspect from 1900 that, allowing for natural aging, could perfectly match Wycliffe. It also mentioned a peculiar detail. The man in Missouri had a visible scar on his left hand, between his thumb and forefinger. This detail prompted Patterson to review his records. Several North Carolina residents who had briefly interacted with Wycliffe mentioned noticing a scar on his left hand, though no one had asked about its origin. It was another piece of the puzzle falling into place, suggesting they were dealing with someone who had left a trail of tragedy across multiple states for possibly 15 years or more. The magnitude of this recognition was overwhelming. If all these connections were confirmed, Wycliffe would be responsible for dozens of disappearances throughout his life, and that's only considering the cases that had been reported and documented. How many others were never officially documented? How many people disappeared without anyone searching or without the authorities being notified? These questions tormented Patterson. He began keeping a personal file on the case, documenting every detail, every connection, every theory. It became almost an obsession for him, a need to understand not only what had happened, but also how someone could operate this way for so long without being stopped. In July, a new lead emerged. A merchant traveling through East Tennessee reported seeing a man matching Wycliffe's description in a remote village near the Smoky Mountains. The man was buying supplies and had mentioned heading west, possibly to Arkansas. Patterson sent notices to authorities in that region, but by the time the information arrived and was processed, any lead had been lost. The frustration of always being one step behind weighed heavily on the entire investigation. Wycliffe seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to remain invisible when necessary, blending in with other travelers and itinerant workers crisscrossing the country at the time. In a vast and still poorly connected nation, where thousands of people were constantly on the move seeking work or new opportunities, a man determined to disappear could do so with relative ease. The summer of 1912 brought sweltering heat to the North Carolina mountains. The investigation of the Wycliffe estate had concluded, and the site was sealed off by authorities. No one wanted to approach the cabin, and rumors began to circulate among locals that the area was cursed. Some swore they heard strange sounds coming from that direction at night, though it was more likely just the natural echoes of the mountains, amplified by collective fear. Patterson continued to receive correspondence from different parts of the country. Each letter brought a new piece of what seemed like a macabre mosaic, spread across several states. A pattern began to emerge as he organized all the reports in chronological order. Wycliffe, or whoever it was, followed a predictable cycle. They would arrive in a remote region, settle in an isolated location close to travel routes, stay for 2 to 4 years, and then disappear when suspicions began to grow. A particularly disturbing aspect was his ability to accurately judge when it was time to leave. In each location, he had left before concrete evidence was gathered against him. In Missouri, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, it was always the same story. Growing suspicions, preliminary investigations, and then the man simply disappeared, leaving only unanswered questions. North Carolina had been different only because the discovery of Richardson's clothing accelerated the investigation before Wycliffe could completely clear his tracks. In August, Patterson received an unexpected visitor. An elderly man named Albert Grayson had traveled all the way from Kentucky specifically to speak with him. Grayson was the father of a young man named David who had disappeared in 1899 while traveling through Missouri. For over a decade, Grayson had searched for answers about his son's fate, following every clue, no matter how small. When Grayson read about Wycliffe's case in the newspapers, something clicked in his mind. He had notes from his own investigation into David's disappearance, including descriptions of a suspicious man who lived near his son's last known location. The descriptions perfectly matched Wycliffe, including the scar on his left hand and his peculiar way of avoiding direct eye contact. Grayson brought with him a small daguerreotype of David, one of the last photographs taken before his departure. He was a 23-year-old boy with hopeful eyes and a confident smile, about to embark on a journey he believed would be the beginning of a new life. Seeing that image brought a deeply human dimension to Patterson. These weren't just statistics or names in reports. These were real people with families who loved them, whose lives were shattered by their unexplained absence. The meeting with Grayson strengthened Patterson's resolve. He promised the elderly man that he would not give up the search, that he would continue investigating, and that he would do everything in his power to ensure that Wycliffe was eventually captured and brought to justice. It was a heavy promise considering how elusive Wycliffe had proven himself to be, but it was one Patterson intended to honor. In September, news arrived from Arkansas. A rural county sheriff reported that a man matching the description was temporarily working at a sawmill near the Oklahoma Indian Territory border. The information was only 2 weeks old, the most recent and reliable information they had received in months. Patterson immediately wired back, requesting that the man be detained for questioning. But when local agents arrived at the mill, they discovered the man had left 3 days earlier, telling his co-workers he had received news of a better job opportunity further west. The mill manager recalled that the man had worked hard, kept to himself, and never caused any trouble. He had been paid in cash and disappeared like so many other temporary workers who passed through. The frustration of this near capture was palpable. Patterson began to sense that Wycliffe had some kind of early warning system, some way of knowing when he was wanted. Perhaps he bought newspapers regularly and followed news about the case. Perhaps he had developed a useful paranoia that made him act preemptively at the slightest sign of danger. Whatever the method, it was working perfectly. October brought the first frosts of autumn, and with them a change in the nature of the investigation. Patterson realized that the straightforward hunt wasn't working. Wycliffe was too experienced, too cautious. A different approach was needed. He decided to focus on better understanding the man, his patterns, his psychology, in the hopes of predicting where he might appear next. With the help of a Chapel Hill psychology professor, Patterson began constructing a detailed profile. They analyzed his diary entries, movement patterns, and residential location choices. What emerged was a portrait of someone profoundly intelligent, meticulous, and completely devoid of normal empathy. Wycliffe saw other people not as human beings, but as objects for his purposes. The professor suggested that Wycliffe likely had some formative experience in his youth that shaped his distorted view of humanity, perhaps some trauma or rejection that crystallized into absolute emotional coldness. But without knowing his true identity or personal history, these were mere speculations. The man was a ghost, leaving only destruction in his wake, while keeping his own story completely hidden. In November, Patterson received correspondence from a private investigator in St. Louis, Missouri. The man had read about the case and believed he had relevant information. According to him, in 1897, a family named Wycliffe had lived on the outskirts of the city. They had a son, Henry, who would have been approximately 45 years old in the present day. But records showed that this Henry Wycliffe had died in a carriage accident in 1898. This discovery opened up an intriguing possibility. What if the man they knew as Henry Wycliffe had assumed the identity of someone who had died? This was a common practice in those days, when records were poorly kept and identity verification was rudimentary. Someone could easily assume the name of a deceased person and live under that identity, especially if they stayed away from areas where the original family was known. If this were true, it meant they still didn't even know the real name of the man they were searching for. He was literally a ghost, operating under stolen identities from the dead, leaving a trail of tragedy while remaining completely anonymous. The magnitude of this revelation was both fascinating and terrifying. The winter of 1912 descended heavily on the Appalachian Mountains, bringing with it heavy snow and temperatures that froze streams. The investigation entered a more contemplative phase, with Patterson devoting long hours to reviewing documents, connecting the dots, and trying to build a deeper understanding of the man they hunted. Wycliffe's estate remained abandoned, its boarded-up windows still holding secrets that might never be fully revealed. During these colder months, Patterson began receiving reports of sightings that seemed to follow a westward trajectory. In December, a telegram from Kansas mentioned a temporary worker on a wheat farm who matched the description. In January of 1913, rumors of someone similar working on a railroad in Colorado surfaced. Each report was investigated, but they always arrived too late, finding only memories of co-workers and no physical trace. What was clear was that Wycliffe had adopted a new strategy. Instead of settling in a single location, he was constantly on the move, working stints here and there, never staying long enough to arouse suspicion or create traceable connections. It was a nomadic existence, perfectly suited for someone who needed to remain invisible while authorities searched for him in multiple states. Patterson began to wonder about the sustainability of this perpetual flight. Wycliffe was aging, and staying constantly on the move required considerable physical and financial resources. At some point, he would need to settle down again, and when he did, he would be vulnerable. The key was patience and keeping the information network active enough to capture him when that moment arrived. In February 1913, almost a year after the initial discovery at the property, Patterson organized a conference with law enforcement officials from 7 different states. It was an unprecedented event, bringing together sheriffs, deputies, and a few private investigators in Asheville, North Carolina. The goal was to share information, standardize communication methods, and create a cooperative network to track criminals operating across state lines. The Wycliffe case was presented as a prime example of the type of criminal this network would seek to capture. Patterson shared all the details he had collected, the connections between different cases, the patterns he had identified. The response was impressive. Several participants recognized similarities with cases in their own jurisdictions that they had never connected before. The magnitude of the problem became clear. There were more people operating like Wycliffe than anyone had imagined. A Wyoming sheriff shared a particularly disturbing case. Between 1911 and 1912, multiple ranch hands had disappeared in a specific region. The circumstances were different from Wycliffe's, but the pattern of a predator exploiting the vulnerability of itinerant workers was the same. The conference revealed that the problem was not isolated, but systemic, exploiting the weaknesses of a growing nation where many people lived on the margins of society. The conference resulted in the creation of an informal system of monthly telegrams, where each jurisdiction would share information about unsolved disappearances and suspects on the move. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't legally binding enough to easily cross state lines, but it was a start. It was an attempt to build something that would eventually become essential to law enforcement, communication and cooperation between different jurisdictions. March brought the spring thaw and with it news that made Patterson's heart race. A sheriff in Nebraska reported detaining a man for questioning after he was seen wandering near a farm where a worker had recently disappeared. The physical description matched Wycliffe, including the scar on his left hand. The man was being held in custody pending further investigation. Patterson immediately made arrangements to travel to Nebraska. The journey would take several days, involving multiple train connections through several states. Throughout the trip, he carried photographs of the objects found on the North Carolina property, hoping they could be used for positive identification. He also carried copies of the diary pages in Wycliffe's distinctive handwriting. When he finally arrived in the small town of Kearney, Nebraska, in mid-April, Patterson was met by the local sheriff, a man named Thomas Webster. Webster took him to the jail where the suspect was being held. The moment he saw the man for the first time was tense. Was this Wycliffe at last, or just another dead end in an investigation that had already had so many? The man in the cell fit the general physical description. He had a thick beard, the right height, and the scar on his left hand, but when Patterson showed him the photographs and mentioned the property in North Carolina, the man seemed genuinely confused. His reaction didn't seem staged. He explained that he was a seasonal worker named James Murphy, originally from Iowa, and that he had never been to North Carolina in his life. Subsequent checks confirmed the man's story. There were employment records, witnesses who had known him for years, documentation establishing his identity. The scar on his hand was the result of a workplace accident 5 years earlier, documented in medical records. It wasn't Wycliffe. He was simply an unlucky worker who had the misfortune of superficially resembling the man they were looking for. The disappointment was profound, but Patterson tried not to let it get him down. This was the problem with general physical descriptions in an era without readily available photographs. Many men could vaguely match Wycliffe's description. A thick beard, medium height, and scars were common among laborers who lived hard lives. Without a clear photograph or very specific distinguishing marks, every potential sighting had to be investigated, even knowing that most would be false alarms. Patterson returned to North Carolina empty-handed, but with a renewed understanding of the challenge they faced. Wycliffe was somewhere out there, likely working under another assumed name, mingling with thousands of other itinerant workers crisscrossing the country. Finding him would require not only hard work and cooperation, but also a considerable dose of luck. The year 1913 progressed with growing frustration. Wycliffe's trail seemed to have gone completely cold after the previous winter's sightings. Monthly telegrams from the sheriff's network continued to circulate, but no new reports offered any concrete connections to the case. It was as if the man had simply evaporated, dissolving into the vastness of the American West, where thousands of anonymous workers lived transient lives. Patterson didn't give up, but he had to accept the reality that the case had become a long-term investigation. He kept the file updated, responded to each new report, but he also had to devote his attention to other matters that required the Madison County Sheriff's presence. Life in the mountains continued, with its own challenges and needs, and it couldn't be put on hold indefinitely because of a single case, no matter how important. During the summer, Patterson received a visit from a Cincinnati writer interested in documenting the case for a book on unsolved crimes in America. The man, named Richard Ashford, had spent years collecting stories from around the country, cases that revealed the darkest aspects of human nature and the limitations of the justice system of the time. Ashford spent 2 weeks in Madison County, interviewing witnesses, examining evidence, and visiting the abandoned Wycliffe estate. He had a different perspective, seeing the case not just as a criminal investigation, but as a window into understanding broader issues about society, justice, and the vulnerability of certain groups of people in America at that time. Conversations with Ashford helped Patterson process some of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The writer noted that Wycliffe had systematically exploited the structural weaknesses of early 20th century American society. The mobility of workers, the lack of centralized identification systems, the vast distances between communities, and the poor communication between jurisdictions created an environment where a determined and intelligent person could operate with near impunity. Ashford also noticed something that Patterson had missed. Wycliffe's identified victims had something in common besides being lone travelers. They were all people who were, in some sense, disconnected from strong social networks. They weren't just loners by circumstance, but individuals whose disappearance would take time to be noticed and investigated. Wycliffe had a macabre talent for identifying precisely these people. In September, Ashford's book was published. It devoted 3 chapters to the Wycliffe case, presenting it as an example of a broader phenomenon of predators operating on the margins of American society. The publication brought renewed attention to the case, with newspapers across the country republishing summaries of the story. Patterson hoped this exposé would generate new leads, that someone somewhere would recognize the details and make a useful connection. And indeed, new information began to arrive. A letter came from a woman in Oregon who believed her missing husband, a geologist who had set out to study rock formations in the Appalachians in 1909, might have been one of the victims. She sent a detailed description of his belongings, including a pocket watch with a specific inscription. Patterson checked it against the inventory of found objects and found an exact match. Another account came from a man in Texas whose brother, a traveling bookseller, had disappeared in 1911 while on a route that would have taken him through North Carolina. The dates and itinerary perfectly matched the period in which Wycliffe was operating. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place, another family finally getting heartbreaking answers about the fate of someone they loved. Each new identification reinforced the magnitude of Wycliffe's actions. The confirmed number of victims now exceeded 20, spread across at least 6 different states and spanning more than a decade. And these were just the cases that could be confirmed through physical evidence. How many others had been his victims, whose belongings were never found or whose disappearances were never officially reported? In October of 1913, almost 2 years after the initial discovery, Patterson received a telegram from a county sheriff in New Mexico. A man had been found dead under suspicious circumstances in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, making identification difficult, but there were some notable details. The scar on his left hand and, in his coat pocket, some papers with notes that appeared similar to Wycliffe's handwriting. Patterson immediately responded, requesting more information and offering to travel to New Mexico to examine the evidence in person. But the response he received presented complications. The body had been found at the bottom of a canyon, apparently the result of a fall. The terrain conditions and the time elapsed since death made it impossible to determine whether it was an accident, suicide, or something more sinister. The possibility that Wycliffe was dead was both a relief and a frustration. Relief because it would mean he could no longer cause harm. Frustration because it would mean there would never be a trial, there would never be complete answers, there would never be justice in the traditional sense of the word. The victims' families would have to settle for the knowledge that the perpetrator was dead without ever having the opportunity to confront him in court. Patterson made the long journey to New Mexico in November. The trip through increasingly arid landscapes, from the humid Appalachian forests to the deserts of the Southwest, was a reminder of the vastness of the country where Wycliffe had operated. When he finally reached the town of Santa Fe, he was taken to where the body had been found and where the few recovered belongings were being stored. The papers found in the pocket were fascinating. They were fragments of a diary, loose pages with entries dated August and September of 1913. The handwriting perfectly matched that found in the North Carolina diaries. The entries spoke of solitude in the mountains, of reflections on choices made and paths followed. There was a melancholy in these pages, absent from the earlier writings, as if the author were reaching some kind of inner reconciliation. One particularly striking entry read, "At heights where the air is thin and thoughts are clear, a man finally sees the weight of his actions without the distortions of justification. Mountains do not judge, they only reflect back what we truly are." It was almost philosophical, a dramatic change in tone from the cold, practical writings encountered previously. The analysis of the body found in New Mexico proved more complex than Patterson had anticipated. The local doctor who examined the remains estimated that death had occurred approximately 2 months before the discovery, placing it sometime in August 1913. Advanced decomposition, accelerated by the Southwest's summer heat, made it impossible to determine specific details about the cause of death beyond the obvious fall from the canyon. Patterson spent days examining the site where the body was found. It was a particularly treacherous stretch of trail that wound through the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The path was narrow, with a steep rock face on one side and a 200-foot drop on the other. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence that anyone else had been involved. It appeared to be a genuine accident, though the possibility of suicide could not be completely ruled out. The few belongings recovered included, in addition to the diary papers, a few silver coins, a worn pocket knife and fragments of clothing that matched Wycliffe's usual style. But there was something frustrating about the inability to definitively confirm the identity. Without a clear photograph of Wycliffe, and with the body in such a state of decomposition, Patterson had to rely on circumstantial evidence: the scar, the handwriting, the location, the timing. A local shepherd named Miguel Cordova had discovered the body while searching for lost sheep. He mentioned something interesting during questioning. About 3 weeks before the discovery, he had seen a lone man camping in that mountainous region. The man had waved from afar but didn't approach to talk, a common behavior among those seeking solitude in the heights. Cordova described the man as having a thick beard and seeming to carry an invisible weight on his shoulders, like someone running from something or searching for something he couldn't find. It was a curiously poetic observation coming from a simple pastor, but it captured something essential about what Patterson had learned over nearly 2 years of investigating Wycliffe. Back in Santa Fe, Patterson spent a final night reviewing all the materials before deciding how to proceed. The diary pages found on the body contained reflections that suggested that Wycliffe, if it was him, was experiencing some sort of existential crisis. There were mentions of faces appearing in dreams, voices echoing in the solitude of the mountains, questions about the meaning of a life lived in the shadows. One particularly revealing passage read, "A man may travel thousands of miles, cross mountains and rivers, change names as one changes clothes, but he can never truly escape himself. Geographical distance does not bring distance of consciousness." It was a veiled admission, an acknowledgement of guilt that had never appeared in his previous writings. Patterson made his decision. Officially, I would declare the case solved with a high probability. The evidence, though circumstantial, strongly pointed to the body being that of Henry Wycliffe, or whoever his real identity was. I would inform the victims' families, allowing them some degree of closure, but I would keep the file technically open, recognizing that without absolute confirmation, there would always be a margin of doubt. The ride back to North Carolina was long and contemplative. Patterson watched the changing landscapes from desert to plains, from plains to hills, and finally back to the familiar Appalachian mountains. He thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by this case, about the fragility of justice, and how evil could operate so effectively in the empty spaces between communities. In December 1913, Patterson organized a meeting with representatives of the families of the identified victims. It was an emotionally charged gathering, held at the village church where he shared the details of what had been discovered in New Mexico. Some found comfort in the likely resolution. Others struggled with the lack of absolute certainty. All carried the pain of losses that would never be fully healed. Elizabeth Bellamy, Marcus's widow, expressed something that resonated with many present. She said that for years she had clung to the irrational hope that her husband was still alive somewhere, that perhaps he had lost his memory or decided to start a new life. Now, even with the pain of knowing the truth, there was a certain peace in finally being able to grieve properly and move on. The case of Henry Wycliffe became part of the dark history of Appalachia, a story told in hushed tones on winter nights when the wind howled through the pines. The property where it was discovered remained abandoned for decades. No one wanted to live there, and eventually nature reclaimed the space, with trees growing through the rotting boards and vines covering the stone walls. Patterson remained sheriff until 1922, when he retired after 3 decades of service. He kept the file on Wycliffe until the end, occasionally reviewing it when new reports of disappearances came in, always looking for patterns that might indicate the presence of another predator operating in a similar manner. The experience had changed his views on justice and the limitations of human systems to prevent evil. The informal network of communication between sheriffs that had emerged from the case continued to grow, eventually evolving into more formal systems of cooperation between different jurisdictions. In a sense, Wycliffe's dark legacy contributed to improvements in law enforcement methods that would benefit future generations. It was small consolation in the face of tragedy, but it was something. Years passed, and the case gradually faded from public consciousness, replaced by new tragedies and scandals. But for those directly affected, the memory remained vivid. Children and grandchildren of the victims grew up hearing stories of ancestors who set out on journeys and never returned, of a time when the mountains held deadly secrets, and of a man whose name became synonymous with terror in that region. The decades following the Henry Wycliffe case brought profound changes to the United States and the way crimes were investigated. Roads improved, communication between states became more efficient with the expansion of the telegraph and later the telephone, and more sophisticated identification systems were gradually implemented. The kind of anonymity that Wycliffe had exploited so effectively became increasingly difficult to maintain. By the 1920s, as America entered the Jazz Age and accelerated social transformation, the case had already become something of a legend in the mountains of North Carolina. Local historians occasionally revisited the archive, trying to glean new insights from the old documents and faded photographs of the evidence, but definitive answers remained elusive, hidden in the shadows of time and the gaps in the documentation. The property where everything had been discovered was eventually acquired by the county and turned into public land. The cabin had completely collapsed in the 1930s, consumed by humidity, time, and willful neglect. No effort was made to preserve it. Some places carry memories too heavy to be preserved as monuments. Nature reclaimed that space, covering it with a layer of vegetation that slowly erased the physical traces of the horror that had occurred there. Albert Grayson, the father who had traveled from Kentucky seeking answers about his son David, lived until 1927. In his later years, he corresponded regularly with Patterson, sharing reflections on loss, justice, and the human capacity for both good and evil. When Grayson passed away, he was buried next to a cenotaph for David, a symbolic marker for a son whose body was never recovered, but whose memory lived on in his father's heart. Patterson died in 1934 at the age of 72. In his personal papers, his family found notes written shortly before his death, final reflections on the case that had defined so much of his career. He wrote of how the Wycliffe case had revealed not only one man's capacity for evil, but also the systemic vulnerabilities of a rapidly expanding society, where progress created new spaces for human tragedy. One of Patterson's most profound observations in these final notes concerned the nature of justice. He questioned whether Wycliffe's likely death in the New Mexico mountains truly constituted justice, or merely the end of a story without the moral resolution the victims and their families deserved. A trial would have allowed the full truth to be revealed, the victims to be publicly acknowledged, and the legal system to affirm society's values. Instead, there was only silence and uncertainty. In the 1950s, when academic researchers began systematically studying historical crimes using more scientific methods, the Wycliffe case received renewed attention. A master's thesis at the University of North Carolina examined the sociological aspects of the case, analyzing how economic factors, population mobility, and institutional weaknesses had created the conditions for predators like Wycliffe to operate. The study concluded that Wycliffe was not an isolated case, but part of a broader phenomenon in late 19th and early 20th century America. Industrialization, westward expansion, and massive social change had created a floating population of workers and travelers who existed on the margins of organized society. These individuals were particularly vulnerable, and those with predatory intentions learned to exploit this vulnerability. In 1986, during construction work in a remote area of Tennessee, not far from Wycliffe's last known location before his disappearance westward, workers discovered human remains buried in a pattern that suggested they were not natural burials. The ensuing archaeological investigation revealed evidence that matched Wycliffe's modus operandi. The connection could never be definitively confirmed, but the similarities were unsettling. This discovery raised questions that could never be fully answered. How many other victims existed beyond those identified? How many locations in the vast expanses of the Appalachian Mountains still held buried secrets? The true magnitude of Wycliffe's crimes would likely never be known, lost in the depths of time and geography. Henry Wycliffe's story remains a grim reminder of a time when the United States was a nation of vast distances and limited communication, when the determined and unscrupulous could exploit these conditions to commit terrible acts. It is also a story about the limitations of human justice, about how not all cases end with clear resolutions, and about how some questions remain unanswered no matter how hard we try to find them. Today, the area where Wycliffe's estate once stood is known only to a few local historians and true crime enthusiasts. Hiking trails pass near the site, and occasionally someone knowledgeable about the history pauses there, gazing at the overgrown clearing and trying to imagine the events that took place there more than a century ago. The mountains hold their secrets, and the wind blowing through the pines carries echoes of stories that may never be fully told. The case's legacy extends beyond the individual tragedy. It contributed to gradual changes in how crimes involving multiple jurisdictions were handled, helped establish precedents for cooperation between different law enforcement agencies, and served as a case study for generations of investigators on the importance of recognizing patterns and sharing information across administrative boundaries. For the victims' families, the case never truly ended. Subsequent generations grew up with stories of lost ancestors, lives cut short, and potential unfulfilled. Some found ways to transform this pain into positive action, working to improve security systems or supporting organizations that help families of missing persons. Others simply carried the memory in silence, a burden passed down through the generations. We've reached the end of this journey through one of the darkest chapters in Appalachian history. Henry Wycliffe's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, the societies we build, and the spaces where evil can flourish when we're not vigilant. It's a story without a perfectly satisfying resolution, reflecting the reality that not all stories end with clear and definitive justice. If this story touched you in any way, if you found yourself gripped by every revelation and every dark twist of this investigation that spanned states and decades, consider subscribing to the channel. There are many more forgotten stories waiting to be told, cases that reveal fascinating and disturbing aspects of American history. Leave a like if you appreciated how we delved deeper into this mystery, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe the body found in New Mexico was actually Wycliffe, or did he manage to escape and live under another identity, somewhere far away? The story remains open to interpretation, and I'd love to hear your perspective. Until the next story, stay safe, and remember that the past is never as distant as we imagine.